Hello, fellow engineers, and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Abuck Nasty. In last episode, we talked about some of the wonderful submissions that we had for automation science and the UPS wars that we're conducting right now. So I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a segue into some preliminary testing that I'm doing on is Q2 or running uncommon science equivalents worth it compared to running everything now with just the common equivalent. So what you're seeing here is this is making 960 per second red science in the common variety. And on the right, you're seeing the basically 480 per second in the uncommon variety. So both of these are equivalent in terms of effective science that they're creating. The question that kind of comes about is this more optimal to run something like this and ship in calcite in order to make the liquids on Nauvis? Or is running and doing the mining rigs that I've shown in previous videos, is that a better setup to upcycle the ore and create uncommon here on Nauvis as well? So given some of the findings that we had in the previous video, we realized that direct insertion is always going to be better. And there was a lot of designs that used a lot of the concepts that I had in this core design here, where we just fed everything on belts and then effectively just had a clocking going on by following the lead and then just turning on and off all of the inserters. This is a decent build. I wound up taking some of the core concepts that we found out that was superior with the previous design competition, and I applied that to the uncommon variety so that I can see, can I make it a little bit more UPS efficient of the uncommon design? And I actually have that here to showcase today. So a lot of the concepts, as I'm going to go through this before we dive into this, is we are effectively trying to get as many beacons as we can around every single component. We're seeing that kind of right now, and these are some takeaways that I'm having from as I look more and more into it. We're seeing that kind of like somewhere around 7 or 8 beacons is kind of a sweet spot for direct insertion builds. If you can get somewhere around that in terms of the amount of beacons you can get around a component, and then Foundry to kind of an exception, you get like 6 or 8 around them, that's fine. So just because of how fast they wind up making items. That is just a rule of thumb. Don't take that as an actual advice, but that's just something that we already saw just with automation science, that somewhere around like 6 or 7 seems like to be a good spot. These designs work really well because they're direct insertion and they have almost minimal wake times completely, except for just a few of them that are just over capacity, that are just dumping the excess and topping up the belts themselves when needed. So I took some of these concepts and I said, okay, well, let me go and here's my original automation science build that I have a video on how I designed it. And then I took the same exact concepts that I had from that build in terms of all the inserter clocking, so that's all exactly the same. The difference is just I've created a very different layout for it. So the main difference here is this is kind of split here in half. So if we take, like, let's say this top section here, just to kind of look at it, the way that this works is it's using a lot of the concepts that we've been going over in the previous videos. So I'm going to try to go over them kind of quickly. So side loading like this was something that we found has just been superior because it's easier to clock the inserters. When the inserters are dumping like this one is here all the time, and this is considered an active state. And so for minimizing UPS, what we really want to do is just try to have the least active components at any point in time. So this is not ideal that this is constantly outputting like this, but this is only one inserter out of the full build. So the rest of them are all clocked and use this kind of side loading concept. So it's side loads. It's a little bit cheaper in terms of merges for belts than it is with inserters. Like, inserters are probably one of the most expensive items. So because they are, have an animation state, they're active, they have to scan belts, etc. So once we're loading onto belt or pulling from a belt, we want to have the least interaction that we can. So that is one of the core concepts here, is that every single thing on here is trying to sideload. The second thing that exists is we're trying to squeeze as many beacons as we can get around it. So you can see here over on the right that this is 8 beacons around these 2 different science assemblers. There is 6 beacons. It's like the best that we could kind of fit around that. You could kind of argue that you could fit one more here. and to get us to that nice 7 count. And then the furnaces that are inside already here are at 7. To make this tileable, I just decided to make this, instead of having 7, just to have it 6, because then it's easy to just copy and paste this and place it right next to each other like that. So then you can have 2 builds right next to each other. So otherwise, if you didn't want to have this tileable, you could do this and you can get it to a nice sweet spot of having 7 beacons around there. So, or actually, you know what? I think it's just because this one actually happens to have 7, and this one has 7, and this one has 7. So I must have like a different layout somewhere here. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. All right, great. And that's fixed. So that's what I was going to say. All these should have 7. All right. So that's what I kind of opted this for, is that these all have 7 beacons on them. This one doesn't matter because this one's always outputting, so this is going to be slightly over anyway, but that's fine. Now everything's in a good spot. The rest of all the inserters are all controlled using lead follower, so they all come down here. We read basically the contents of this furnace is our lead, and it's all just this one block is what's considered our lead. I happen to just double this. This is redundant. I just didn't want to deal with running all the wires individually to each side of this. We could remove all of these extra combinators and have it just listen to this right-hand side, or just the left-hand side, which would be probably better to reduce the number of combinators, because combinators aren't really free. At least on my CPU and on my machine, circuits are preferred over wake lists, and it seems like on most machines that's the case. So I'm trying to just minimize, and when I talk about wake lists, just the concept, all these yellow and red lights in the debug menu when you press F5 and then you go and turn on the show active state, and then more specifically show the wake lists. That's what pops up and shows these icons. So I have them all enabled in a way that everything is circuit controlled, and they're all just basically a check mark that comes from a combinator. So why am I showing this design? Well, I wound up going with the theory of like, hey, if we maximize direct insertion as much as possible, even though the number of entities here are higher, there's less interactions with a belt, and there's technically then there's probably the same number of components that are active, but they are just going to basically directly be just transferring from one machine to another, and that's been found to be just better overall for these builds. So the question that I have is today to kind of explore is, okay, first let's figure out, is this particular design better than the previous iteration that I had here? And then let's see if we can compare whichever one of these is better and start getting some insights into, is uncommon better than common? And what kind of a testing scenario is this going to look like as the UPS war competition continues to go forward? By the way, if you missed that, go check out the last video. And we went on a deep dive on all the different designs on why this was the most UPS optimal design. And then ultimately, let's try to compare these two and try to get some preliminary understandings in terms of insights into, like, is common the way to go on Nauvis? Is uncommon the way to go on Nauvis, or vice versa? Also, quick side note, I get a lot of comments all the time asking about, okay, why don't you do science on Vulcanus? Well, let me explain a couple of those reasons here next. So I produce all my science on Nauvis. Why do I do this? Well, because when you think about the number of sciences that are coming in from Nauvis, you have 6 sciences that are going to be belt fed. This is just going to be logistically easier to do. The only materials you're ever going to have to import for any of the sciences that you're creating on Nauvis is the only import is ever going to be calcite. And you're going to need some version of calcite to basically be able to go and create all the molten metals that you need. I've decided, as just a design choice, that I wound up going with a fully uncommon design everywhere on Nauvis. I just chose that. I'm still exploring right now, and that's the point of like this competition that we have, and then also just some of the optimizations that I'm doing is I'm trying to answer is like for each of the individual sciences, which one's actually going to be the most optimal. So is it like in this version where everything is made in uncommon? Because then, right, instead of like right now, I'm effectively here, I have 8 belts of this material. Technically, I actually have 16 equivalent worth, right? Because there's really like 16 of these lanes of common. So the question that I kind of have is like, for each of these sciences, which one is going to wind up being the most optimal? So I'm going to dive a little bit into red science today, and that's what we're going to go with, is like, is this version the best? Is there, and I'll compare the DI build here in a second. But I want to touch on what I was getting to, which is like, as you can see here, I used to make everything on Vulcanus. So I have these nice little rest in peace signs for purple, red, green, blue. And the builds are actually quite nice in general for what you wind up doing if you're making things on Vulcanus. So here's like an example of a build that I wound up having. So I'll just pop into the editors just so we can look at it here. So for example here, this was an equivalent design that I used to have for making chemical science on Nauvis. So let me go and open that up. Let me go to my blades, and then I'll go to this one. And this is basically the design. And there's, I think, a problem with it, so I'll look at that here in a second. But, and then I need power somehow to get over here. And then is there any power source I can do? Sure, great, there we go, power. Okay, so this was a design that I had come up with on Vulcanus, and the nice thing is you can just belt all the metals in, and you can effectively just make all the engine units here, and then everything is launched. So now I have I'm absolutely end game here, so everything is at 300% productivity. That's why you're seeing just efficiency modules in this. There's no reason these build so quickly, it doesn't matter. So one of the reasons for this is this is a pretty decent sized build here. This is making effectively 490 chemical science packs per second, or that per minute is about 30k. So I had 6 or so of these blades. One of the things that you kind of think about is just think about logistically the overhead that comes from building on Vulcanus, right? So on Vulcanus, one of the things that is really nice about it is that it's so easy to scale. You just input all the molten metals, all the different materials that you're going to end up needing, and you can just make green, all the different, very, very quickly, all the metals that you wind up actually needing. And then ultimately there's also no problems with dealing with pollution. So that's a nice thing about, in general, building things on Vulcanus, is that it's easy to scale. At some point you get into throughput limitations. So it's really hard to make upcycling builds on Vulcanus, except for maybe purple signs you could argue that you make here. But otherwise, for the designs that are here, you have the overhead of all of these rocket launches. So they all launch, and they have to go from Vulcanus. They all have to launch to some space platform. So you're going to need a space platform that is going to bring all the items back and forth. The current meta that exists if you're running common is you're going to need at least 2 ships. So you can see here, for Gleba, I'm running up to 3, and that's just because to preserve freshness. You could even make the argument for running 4 ships for Gleba. For the rest of them, I get away because all my science is uncommon with just running 1 ship. But in general, you always want 1 ship that is over Nauvis that's unloading and another one that's loading. And so they are constantly swapping back and forth. And that's just as you get higher and higher in terms of science per minute, you're eventually getting to a point where you're running into throughput limitations through the hub. Another tip that I don't quite do myself is you want to keep the minimal amount of science in here. You're seeing I'm keeping millions of science in here, and that's actually bad because for UPS sake, the way that this is done is if an inserter is going to check, or a bot is going to check for something that it's going to grab out of the hub here, it's going to start scanning the entire row here, and it's going to have to go and scan all these items until it finally gets to the actual science that it needs. So let's say it's cryogenic science, and then it scans all the way until it has to check the entirety of it, because science packs, of course, have this annoying thing of the amount of capacity that it actually has. So this has a remaining capacity of 200% because it's uncommon. But let's say it was half used. The game doesn't know if it's been half used already or not. So it just it can't make that assumption, so it has to scan everything. So an optimization I should be making, but I haven't bothered with it, is basically making it so that there's the least amount of items in the hub itself. So in order to do that, you need at least 2 ships. So then if you have 6 of your sciences all being made on Vulcanus, right? That means that you have the overhead of all of these rocket silos that are constantly running. Additionally, rocket silos aren't free. You can see here, in the entity statistics, rocket silos are taking right now in my build 0.2 milliseconds of update time. And that's because I have 2,167 of them. So once you remove them, you're seeing these aren't even being used, right? So I have, let's say, 30 of these. If I go and I make this worse on myself, and let's say I just put this here, put an energy interface, get as many of these as possible here. And let's just copy this a few times here. will kind of show like kind of how this impacts UPS. So right now we're seeing that our rocket silos are 2,145. We're at 0.2 milliseconds of update time. Let's go ahead and copy this multiple times here. How many rocket silos is that? So that is an extra 640. Let's look at our UPS now. If you look at rocket silos, we've just jumped up 0.8 milliseconds, or 0.08. And that's because we've just added those number of rocket silos. So imagine if you're running this number of, and this is not enough even probably for running all 6 sciences on Vulcanus. So you're already suffering just from the fact that you have placed the rocket silos. They're not even being used, right? So just to actually prove this out, if I delete all of these, you can watch here the rocket silos go down to 0.2. So we just shaved off 0.1 milliseconds of update time by just simply not having them. So that's already a reason why like just doing things on Vulcanus is already bad. The second thing that kind of comes from that is that now you have then, of course, all the traveling overhead of these ships that are in space and traveling between Vulcanus and Nauvis, the asteroids that are interacting with, having to destroy them, process them, get fuel, all the different requests. And also now you have more rockets or more spaceships hovering above Nauvis. So, and the more spaceships that you have, then there's also more interactions between like, hey, does this item have a request? Does the planet have a request? Do they need it? So the more that you have, effectively, the worse it is. So the more ships you have, etc. So it is an overhead. And then also the chunks that they wind up rendering once they're actually have been placed into space is another issue. Okay, so if you're still not convinced, where I'm kind of coming from then is the final problem is that how do you get all that science out of here? Well, you have to do it by bots. And so one of the things that you're seeing here is that right now I'm running physical projectile damage, and I'm not using any bots almost at all. I'm running completely everything based on inserters. That was the decision that I made and why I made the decision of having the space science packs being inserted here into the cargo wagons and then being put out from here, so that when I'm running Nauvis science, I can have my entity total be extremely low here. And that's one of the benefits, is that I have effectively no real logistics from space when I'm running Nauvis only science. Now, once you start running other sciences, sure, you need it. But imagine if everything was being run from Vulcanus, there would be all of the science would effectively be needing to be delivered by bots. It also means that by not running everything on Vulcanus, all the science, this is a lot more compact, and I don't have to be as granular about exactly where I'm placing everything and be as worried about compactness. And I can do other things like store all my Promethean buffer science here. I can do more things with the hub because when you think about all the science that you're going to use for researching research productivity, there's 12 sciences, right? So if 6 of those are coming from an external planet, and they could just be built on the planet where the research is going to be done anyway, that's half or more than probably half the throughput that has been going through the hub, is because like Prometheum is going to be less than that usually. So just constantly you have 6 sciences that are full throttle running through Vulcanus. And Vulcanus is also not good at being able to make higher quality science, so that's also a knock against it. So, all that being said, these are the reasons why I think like Vulcanus is really good if you want to get to like 1 million SPM. If you want to kind of push, I know I've seen others that have gotten to 2 million SPM doing that. So that's a perfectly scalable thing you can do. Once you start pushing beyond that 2 million breakpoint, you want to move your stuff from Vulcanus back to Nauvis. And granted, you need to do that at a point where you have a sufficiently high mining productivity level. I have an absurd level. This is not something that I would recommend that people have to have is 15,000. I'm doing this just because it's something that I research and anyway, so I just research it all the time. But the point that I'm trying to get to is like, once your mining productivity is high enough, so let's say 1,000 or so, when you feel comfortable, you never have to leave a patch, cool, then just move all your sciences back over to Nauvis. So Vulcanus is really good to scale initially, and then eventually bring everything back to Nauvis in the ultra late game like this. So that's my recommendation. These are the reasoning why I will not be testing Vulcanus, because just the number of steps, everything I've talked about with rocket silos, it's all going to be an overhead that can be avoided if we just choose not to build things on Vulcanus. Okay, So let's go through the tests on the new red science build, and then I'm going to walk you through some of the test setups that I have. I'm not going to draw a conclusion today on if Q2 is better than Q1. I'm just going to make some of my observations. My assumptions right now, based on everything that I'm seeing, is that I think for simpler builds like red science and also for green science down here, this needs to also be rebuilt at some point too, with the same methodology of direct insertion that I talked about. But for both of these kind of builds, their resources are really primitive, so they're not going to necessarily get such a big benefit from basically from common science versus uncommon, because there aren't as many steps of complexity. There's 2 resources here that basically need to be made, and they have intermediaries. And for green science and then for red science, it's just 2 ingredients that effectively need to be made with 1 step to make it. So there's not a lot of productivity chains or benefits to get you far away from the actual upcycling mining setups. And this is probably the most UPS expensive portion of this build. Like, if we compare probably red science 1-to-1 and we ignore like the calcite import and we also ignored the mining setup, my assumption is that this would win. And we can prove that here in a second, but it's kind of an irrelevant thing. We don't care if this wins if we can't actually produce the uncommon ore that we actually need. So like, it's kind of a moot point if red science is better if you don't incorporate the materials that are required. So calcite import for making the direct insertion build for common and making molten fluids in a molten fluid bus versus the upcycling the ores that we're seeing here. So both of those are going to be needing to be considered. That's kind of what I'm going to explore a little bit today. So hopefully this is interesting, but these are kind of some of my insights and also my thoughts on Vulcanus versus Nauvis, and also what I want to test. All right, let's go in and get into some benchmarks. So here's the test setup. I have 128 lanes that are constantly being created of both of the different sciences. These are basically the 2 different builds that are here. So, and I'm realizing right now that probably one of the things I need to do is, it seems like I just saw just for a second, there's like some inconsistencies in the belt here. So, and I think that's actually because of, effectively I need to go and delete all of these basically infinity loaders and then remove them back. So I'll do that before I kick off the benchmark. And I may make sure that the production value is the same. But just, if you're looking at this, what I wanted to just look at is like, okay, is this like a little bit better than the first version? And the way that I'm going to be testing that is just here, there's 16 lanes here, and then coming all the way down, it's 16 by 8. So it's 128 lanes of science that is being created. And then for the other version, the previous version, it also has 128 lanes. So we're just going to run a benchmark. I'm going to go fix this up real quick to make sure that there's no gaps, and then I will talk about which one performs better. My assumption is this one should perform better based on everything that we saw previously, and let's see if we can confirm that. So I ran a benchmark. The last version was called version 3 that I had a video on. This one's version 4, and just looking at this, there was a noticeable improvement. Both of the saves were run for 36,000 ticks and for 3 runs. They both make 1.8 million uncommon science per minute per save, and so the equivalent is 128 fully stacked lanes of uncommon red science. So looking at this, the overall scores between the 2, this one wound up getting basically an average millisecond update time of 0.728, and an average for the version before was 0.847. So the lower that is, the better. And you can see that the effective UPS on my machine when I'm running these 2 is these 2 different values. So what does that actually mean in terms of the numbers? So that means that this was about a 16% improvement by just doing direct insertion. So great. So that's a pretty good one. And you're looking at it here too. The control behavior update went a little bit up because we're controlling more entities with circuits. And that's also probably because of the number of combinators that I have. So probably something that I could do is remove some of those combinators, and that would also help. But electric entity update was about the same. There's some other updates that are happening in the game that is basically that we're going to ignore. And then but the point is that both of those were equivalent or within about 3 microseconds of each other, so that's fine. And then the main difference here is that although control behavior went up by about 10 microseconds, the entity update time dropped substantially more. So that's kind of just direct insertion, and using that over higher beacon count and less entities is just superior. So let's take this build, this new version that I have, and I'll update my blueprints in case you want to use it. But overall, I'll also post the results at the end of this video here for just these two comparisons. But let's dive a little bit into what I'm trying to do for how to test these on Nauvis to make it actually fair. Okay, so here is an example save of basically what I'm trying to test here. So there's a couple impacts of running uncommon science and common science. So uncommon science needs, or common science like this, running normal science is going to need some form of calcite import. So, and then the mining setups for them are, right, it's probably the best way to do it is just direct insertion, running them directly into a foundry, and having that foundry then as a fluid bus connect to all of these. This was the best design on my particular machine from the competition, so that's why I'm using it. And then I'm directly feeding them into a lab setup. So these are the same labs that I've designed in the past in a previous video, and so I'm using them. From the benchmarks that I've run already with this particular setup, I've had some issues in terms of noise. And I think what I want to do is probably the better way to test this is just remove all this extra stuff that's here, all these extra inserters, all these extra basically control logic and all this, and just have a very simple on-off state for just the red circuits, and then remove everything else, because the rest of them don't need circuits, and that's probably adding a whole bunch of extra control behavior update time that's completely unnecessary for this test. So that's probably what I'm going to wind up doing. So this is a 4096 lab setup. So there's 4096 labs, all region cloned, all with basically all of these, and then one gigantic calcite line that goes all the way down here and feeds everything. So in order to run this amount of science, like, what does this actually mean? So this is making almost 1 million red science per minute, and that's just because I need to have enough update time just to have like some signal that's high enough and stressing the machine. So that is basically how much we're actually going and creating. And for this particular save, I have a very low research productivity level, so that's why you're not seeing the numbers be quite drastically as high. But with this setup here, the question that I had was like, if you're making like 910,000, we need only like 3,000 calcite per minute. So you don't need a lot. So then the overhead is probably not as much of just importing calcite. But how are we simulating that? So got this nice ship called the Calcite Enjoyer. This is a ship that was designed by Stupid Fat Hobbit. So I just used his exact same design, and which has some slight tweaks from me, but it's basically the exact same. So just go check him out. He's got some really good and late game ships. So I'm using it, and I'm mainly using it because it has it's not using lasers on the front, and that's more UPS optimal than just to use effectively gun turrets to destroy everything, because they just annihilate all the different asteroids so much faster. So this ship effectively just picks up like 16,000 calcite, and it picks it up from Vulcanus. For Vulcanus, the setup is really like straight simple. All it is just effectively just direct inserted big mining drills that go directly into a rocket, and then those all go and launch. And so there are 16 of them, so it can launch 500 at a time, so it's 8,000. So in 2 volleys, it can send everything up to this ship, the Calcite Enjoyer. And then it continues to just drop calcite until basically it gets less than 500, and then it just goes back and gets more. So that is kind of the setup. So that's how I'm simulating it for the Q1 science. And then for Q2, you don't necessarily need calcite to actually, right? Because there's no need for it, because you're just going to use a mining upcycling ship. So for that, the way that I have that set up is we will go and look at that here real quick. And then, so here's how they have that. This is the one that I just showed, was the labs with the ship. And then I have 2 flavors, one that has, for Q2, that has a ship that's just hovering, and one that has no ship hovering, just to kind of rule out, is there any extra? Like, in reality, you probably just use like your metallurgic science or your orange science ship to just import calcite from Vulcanus. And the reason I'm doing that from Vulcanus is it's probably the more UPS optimal than harvesting it from space, because asteroids and the particular yield that you get for calcite is really low. So like producing the amount that you wind up needing in an actual ship is probably not as efficient as just straight directly shipping it from Vulcanus. So for Q2, right, I still have I've killed all the demolishers that are in this area just to make sure that that's not an outlier. And then also just made so it has the same chart scan, so that's not a difference in the background noise of updating all these tiles in case that's a difference. So those are the same. And then I just have it's the same ship, just different name, Watcher of the Night. It just happens to be sitting here above Nauvis. So, and it's doing nothing. It's requesting nothing, needs nothing, because it isn't actually importing anything, and we have no imports, but like still the same surface areas here. The main difference is that we're using the new build that I have set up, right? And it winds up feeding in all of the raw upcycled ore. So I know that I have 2 of these here. These aren't doing anything. These are just sitting here, and they're considered pretty much all the time off. So I'm not really considering this as being like part of the test. And in fact, we could even just go and delete this completely, which probably I should wind up doing for consistency's sake. Anyway, but this is the exact same setup. The only difference is that, so it still has 4,096 labs. It's just now using this build itself. So just comparing these is a thing that I'm trying to do. And this is like probably the hardest thing to really test, because like, how do you really quantify what is a calcite import? Because if you're just looking at red science, you're never going to run red science by itself. There is no research that does that. So like, effectively, this particular test will be a lot better once I have a red, green, blue, and purple build, and having all of those all running at the same time. And I won't need the sheer number of labs because I'll have so much more science that's being generated by other builds. So take this with a grain of salt. I'm trying some different things and seeing what is going to be the best way to kind of benchmark these. So also curious what your thoughts are. Leave some comments in the description or in the YouTube video below if you have some ideas on how to do this differently. But that's kind of my approach, is like, okay, let's have one that has just a ship, just so that it has the same basically startup, like the same concept of a ship being above Nauvis. Let's have one for Q2, one for Q1. Let's import calcite for what we need, and then also have a version that doesn't have any. So I also have one that is 2,048 labs, but let's just go and see what this looks like first. And then if this doesn't seem like a good way to get some insights, what I'm going to wind up doing is then I'll probably do what I said before and delete all these extra inserters to try to reduce some of the background noise. Another thing that I want to test as well is I've set up here for Q1 versus Q2. I've set some different setups that are actually just assuming calcite is imported. And the reason I'm doing that is like, so I'll show these 2 saves here. So for this save, the way that this one runs is now I'm taking the best Q1 build that we had from the competition, and I'm making then, I think for this one, 192 lanes. So this one makes 192 lanes, all with, you can see all the fluids that are being piped in, but the only difference is it's just assuming that there is an import of calcite. So it doesn't take into account the ship overhead, bringing calcite in, importing that. This is just like, let's just compare these 2 builds, 1 versus 1, and see what we can get from it. The second one is running as well. Let's go to here, and then I will go and I'm going to open up the this one. So instead of 192 lanes, so it's half of that, this is running now 96 lanes of uncommon to make the same equivalent amount of science. But then all the builds have the upcycling or voiding builds that I have, at least the most optimal version that I personally have created so far. So you're seeing that here, that this is effectively then this build here, and this is where I've already corrected the belt gaps that exist. And then, and actually, you know what? This one still has that issue. I need to go and fix this as well. Great. Okay, I will go and fix that. The point of where I'm kind of getting with this is like, this should be able to produce the same amount of science. And the question that I have is, for this build, is making, in this case, the amount of science here 1.4 million or 2.8 million in the other save, which one winds up being better. So I'll fix this build up and then I'll go run the benchmarks and for all the different saves that I just showed, and then I'll talk through them a little bit more. So I'll be back. Okay, so going over the results first, I'll start with talking about the lab setup that I have. And this is where I think some things are getting a little bit noisy for these tests, because looking at these right now, the Q2 builds performed better than Q1 with the kind of ship overhead. So UPS I just ran these for 108,000 ticks, just so that we had enough like actual travel time for those ships and all the other overhead that's happening. So it barely squeezed past, like just looking at these two, like there's a 4% improvement. This seems weird because when you look at like the verbose metrics for this, and we'll make this bigger, we're seeing that like, okay, and there's some things that kind of make sense, is like the space platform update was a little bit higher for Q1 because it just moving back and forth, but the entity update time is substantially lower. So it kind of is like, and there's also a lot of just other things that are happening, things that I haven't added in terms of other update times. So this is kind of an interesting thing because I'd like to understand what's going on there, but control behavior is about the same here at like 115, 111, 113 respectively, and then entity update time is also a lot lower with Q1. So I'm trying to understand like what is the overhead that exists. I'm not quite sure yet, but this does, so at least when you look at this first one, Q2 seems to be better by 4%. So then if you look a little bit further though, if you look into like the 4096 lab result, and we go and look at that, here Q2 won again, and it happens to be, you know, but there's a lot of variance in all the different tests that I ran. So this was 108,000 ticks in 3 runs. And then looking at this too, is like only 1% difference. So I'm going like, okay, if the percent differences are this low, then the amount of noise that is in the system must be higher than the difference between the actual red science builds. Like that probably is what's happening. And so when I look at like probably a little bit more useful of a test here that exists is, and also just, sorry, just by the way, the reason I'm doing it with the lab setup, and I forgot to mention this earlier, is because the inserter swing time is cut in half when you're running uncommon science. So that's a theory that I want to work through and see, is that better on a lot of inserters for all the labs? Is like, at what point is there a breaking point where that's better? I'm not quite sure yet. So like in my case, I have 6,000 inserters for all the different sciences. So in theory, if those are running half the time, that's 6,000 entities that are at half the rate that they're being consumed, or half the time that they're active. So that might be better. Okay, so when I looked at the maps with no calcite import results, right? This is why I'm thinking there's a lot of noise. There was an obvious difference between Q1 versus Q2. In fact, Q1 was substantially higher, so 0.7 milliseconds of update time for Q1 versus 1.1 milliseconds of update time for Q2. So looking at that, and the variance was very similar between them. This is again 108 and 108,000 ticks, 6 runs that they were run at. And so there's some variance between them, but the point is still the difference. This is something that you can actually measure as a hard change. So this is 63% better. So just looking at one build versus another, I would expect to see this in the full setup. And that's why I think like the setup that I currently have is probably bad for red science by itself. And so probably what I'm going to wind up doing is I need to create some kind of a hybrid that like still incorporates the calcite import, because that is an overhead, but how do we measure that? And I'm still not quite sure. So if you look at the verbose metrics, this is where like it really shines. So Q1, just comparing it against Q2, is the entity update time is like almost cut in half. They're going from 874 to 445, even though we're making the same equivalent amount of science. And my assumption really here, and not assumption, it's the recyclers are just so expensive to run and voiding all that science. So in order to get the payoff, for the uncommon science voiding technique, you need like a lot more chains of production beyond just, okay, take ore, smelt it, turn it into gears, and or just smelt it directly and make copper. Like, it's not going to make that much of a difference or help that much. So back in this save, I've removed a lot of the inserters already and still kept the original control interface that I designed previously. But one of the things that I'm noticing is if you look at just like the sheer number of like assembly machines and like the mining drills and inserters, etc. If you look at like the inserter time, we're at like 0.023. And then the furnaces are almost next to nothing. The assembly machines are almost next to nothing. So like order of magnitude, the labs are taking such a huge chunk of the actual research time, or like the update time. But I think that's probably where this is, why this is existing at that kind of point. So if we like, say I just save this real quick and we just region clone the whole thing just so that we can kind of get a better understanding of kind of what's going on. I'll even keep this, I don't need this controlled overhead, so probably what I'll do is I'll just, let me go region clone this particular area here. This is the main thing that I want, is this head section here. And I will shrink the area selection, and we're going to go south 1. And let's copy that. Great. So now that's copied, I will copy all of this follower section here. And just kind of to prove the point out a little bit more. So if I take this and then copy it one more time down like this, and all I gotta do is just connect up these 2 wires, green and red. Great, and let's just run this a few more times just to get this all the way sped up. So where I'm kind of going with this is like, if we look at this now, again, the labs are now at 0.65, 0.6, something like that. And the furnaces are a third of that. The inserters are taking substantially more update time. It's not quite as exasperated, so let's go and even just take this entire section here and let's clone it several times downward just so that we can prove this out. So I'll shrink this, let's just copy it like, I don't know, 20 times. I'm thinking that the labs themselves are consuming more update time right now than the rest of just red science combined, and I'm trying to prove that out if I have hundreds and hundreds of labs running. And I'm realizing I have to remove all these extra entities here. Yeah, so here we just have an absurd number of labs. We have 0.7 milliseconds of update time. The furnaces are taking, you know, rolling up and down, 0.2. The inserters are at 0.7. So that is a non-zero amount, but it's kind of rolling in waves like this. And also just because we're running half green on the other side, that you can't really benefit from these swinging half as often. They are physically swinging, but there's no point in making them an uncommon schedule for those because half is common and half is uncommon, so you don't even get the benefit from the inserter swings here. So really, like, probably testing this, I would need at least red and green in uncommon versus common to test it out. And so once we're done with the green science for the competition, that might be something that I wind up revisiting here. So this will be just an ongoing series as I continue to kind of dive in to try to decipher and look at the different ones. But otherwise here, where I'm getting at is the labs are taking like a millisecond of update time and the rest of them are smaller. So just like signal to noise ratio, the entities are like mainly labs. So probably the better thing to do is if we go back to that baseline that I had set up, is just replace them with just infinity chests and just have them on a schedule, just like dump everything into infinity chests instead of the actual labs. And that way we can kind of like more control, not necessarily the interaction with the labs, but just remove, because like the labs shouldn't have any difference for them. At least in theory they shouldn't. So just making this infinity chest like this, and I probably will still need 1 lab here. That's fine. And then I just need infinity chests for the rest of this. Alright, so I've cleaned up the save file, and now we have effectively now just the inserters just themselves, the one lab. And the way that I've done this is just because red is getting fed, I still want the lead to listen to it. So I've just simply just set it up so that green is getting fed here, but not the rest of them. And the reason being because otherwise it would always pick up green and it wouldn't pick up red. And that's mainly just because if the lab's in front of it, then it could make a decision one way or another on whether to pick up red or green, just based on the automated insertion slots and the amount of size that's actually in it. So in order to bypass that, just made everything red, and then all the rest of the inserters all just kind of follow the signals here, and now I can actually properly just use either the normal signal or the uncommon signal for the common versus uncommon builds. So now we have this is just the 2048 lab configuration, and I want to just kind of see what this looks like. Just at like first glance of just running this before actually running benchmarks, we're running at just a very, very high UPS update rate, and that's just because the total update time is extremely low. And just removing the labs cut down 1 millisecond of update time, so at least from the 4096 build, and then from here it's basically like 500 or 0.5 milliseconds of update time. So with that being said, we have now a build where we have all the inserters specifically isolated. So this should be at least a rudimentary approach of like saying like, okay, is my assumption that the labs themselves were the primary noise generator or not? So I have this setup, still has the same calcite enjoyer just above, grabbing more calcite from shipping in from Vulcanus. And then I'm just gonna run this version that has 2048 labs, and then another version for the Q2 setup, and we'll go look at benchmarks here next. All right, so we're back with the results. We ran it for 108,000 ticks, which is 30 minutes worth of real time, and then for 3 runs. So looking at this, even though the average MS time is lower than I would like it to be at for an actual benchmark, this isn't it's at only basically 0.374, and compared to where I'd normally want it at 2 ms of update time, but it's enough for us to at least compare and kind of get an understanding of the two and see if it trends in the same direction. So you can see that Q1 had an effective UPS that was higher than Q2. And looking at these two here, the standard distribution was effectively very small between them. So I think like this shows that there isn't a huge variance, so that basically is a good thing for that the runs are relatively consistent. And looking at it, it was basically like a 10% improvement for Q1 versus Q2. So that's a decent thing just to kind of look at. Overall though, if you look at the verbose metrics here, and this is the average across all the runs, if the entity update time is substantially lower, which is what we observed previously in the 1-to-1 without importing calcite. There's a slight overhead from space platform update time, which makes sense, although it's very minimal, so I'm not too concerned about that. There's also probably some entity updates that are happening from miners whenever they're launching, and rocket silos, those kinds of things. There's a lot of just other things, other stats that are in here, so I'm going to probably dive deeper, not in this video, but just what else, other metrics I want to pull to kind of break down where the rest of the whole update time is coming from. As there's some kind of hidden metric that exists, I'm assuming, when you have the ships running a lot more. And so kind of understanding that will help with at least some of these statistics here. So, but still the whole update time is captured, and anything that isn't in the 4 or the 5 different metrics that I have particularly chosen, the whole update is basically the sum of these minus the whole update minus the sum of all of these. And that's the other category. So just this seems like Q1 is better than Q2 for automation science, just because the number of steps that come from going to the voiding setup to the actual production of the science is so small. I'm assuming the effects of doing voiding is going to be more compounded for more complicated builds. And we'll see that as we continue to go, but this is kind of my initial findings that I have, and I'm going to continue to update them. So I'll post the conclusions and some of these preliminary results here. I'll finalize the full README after I'm done with all the sciences on Nauvis and the competition's over, but I'll continue to post small updates like this as we go, so that we can continue to get a little bit more just insights into each of them and kind of compare and contrast between them. So that means I'm also updating my Q2 builds as we go through this process, and I'll be releasing them in my normal blueprints file so that everyone can see them. With that, thank you so much for watching. My name is Abuck Nasty. Have a fantastic rest of your day.